I'm going to talk about Artist Periodical, published in the 1970s. It means this is the kind of periodicals you can find in the Art Pool archive we just visited. This is many of the periodicals I'm going to show are held in the archive. So many artist periodicals appeared in the 60s and 70s as a new artistic medium. With this practice, the place and conception of art in the periodical changed. Rather than using it as a place to reproduce works that exist elsewhere, outside of it, artists began to create works conceived for their reproduction, that is to say, works that have no other existence than in the pages of the periodicals. This leads them to conceive, on the one hand, pieces for periodicals, which interfere with advertising spaces or with the contents of already existing periodicals. On the other hand, they created their own periodical, which were in themselves artistic projects. The periodical, considered as a reproducible work, not only challenged the definition of art and its rarity as a guarantee of quality, but also questioned its condition of visibility. Access to art is no longer limited in time and space through presentation in a gallery or a museum. Moreover, it's not necessary anymore to pass through these intermediaries and their logic and of selection to present the artist's work. Ulises Carrion, a Mexican artist who emigrated to the Netherlands, formulated very early the stakes of these new artistic forms. Speaking about the artist's book, but his remark is valid for all the artist publications, he observed, quote, "It's not enough to confirm that the work doesn't acknowledge spatial limits anymore, but let's not forget that this has practical consequences of great importance. An artist doesn't need to live in an art capital to have his voice heard, and as a matter of fact, there are centers of activity where there are no galleries, only a modest post office." The postal system became the means to escape the hegemony of the official art world. This benefited both the audience and the artists because it considerably increased the number of participants. By this means, it became possible for any artist to quickly reach any recipient, regardless of their geographical location and/or the political climate of the country in which either of them lived. The artist publishers, involved in international networks of artists, then in full bloom, often made their particular geographical position a strength, even an editorial strategy for their periodicals. The analysis of this alternative publication highlights that the question of decentralization was and remains a major issue of many artist periodicals, suggesting the possibility of renewed territorial conceptions. Neon de Suro is a periodical which was published between 1975 and 1982 by 4 artists from the Spanish island of Mallorca, Bartomeu Cabot, Sara Guibert, Andreu, and Steva Terrades. Its 21 issues take the shape of a thin tabloid newspaper with a broad headline written in a Gothic font. Images, and more particularly drawings, can be found on almost all of its pages. Neon de Suro is a prime example of the way the periodical medium has enabled a lot of artists to establish links with other territories. Exchanges was an essential issue for these island artists, doubly isolated from the European art scene, but also from that of Spain, which was then focused on the 2 centers of Barcelona and Madrid. At the time they launched their periodical, the artists had not yet constituted a network outside the island. To achieve this, they sent their periodical, free of charge, to a selection of addresses collected from magazines which seemed of a similar interest. This strategy enabled them to enter the emerging network of mail art without delay and to get in touch with artists who were also editors of alternative periodicals, as Bruno Richard or Julien Blaine, for instance. If free access is often an established fact for alternative edition, the editors of Neon de Suro made it a real issue. In 1978, they co-signed a manifesto entitled "Gratuitousness is an Aggression." The title of this text suggests that this opening to the outer world is done in an aggressive mode, that the aim of this exchange is not solely to share ideas and to circulate artistic projects, but also to destroy. This image of a missile is actually the word used by a Belgian artist periodical, Quatre Taxis, which devoted a special section to Néon des Soureaux in its issue number 8. The periodical is presented there as an independent graphic missile, likely to land at the four corners of the earth in order to deliver its plastic charge, while the island of Majorca is considered as a platform used to smash the context junk. The attack was, of course, not aimed at the people who received the so-called missile, but it echoed the motivation at the origin of the project. It is a reminder of the fact that a feeling of isolation is often what triggered many artists' periodicals. It reflected the anger of the artists due to the lack of consideration they suffer when their activities were not just criticized or rejected, but ignored. On the other hand, it reminds us of the fight led by artists against the art world, the way it operates in a closed circuit, the evaluation criteria used by institutions and galleries, but also the passivity it leads to the reception of the works of art. The art world is not the only one to be in the line of fire of these attacks. Mallorcan artists demonstrated an acute awareness of the excesses of the contemporary world, including those specific to the political and economic situation in Spain, and more specifically to the island of Majorca. If Néon des Soureaux opened up to other territories, it is to spread demanding graphic and plastic research to and from the outside, but also through them to give an account of a culture and a singular history in the midst of deep changes, especially with the arrival of mass tourism. The pages of Néon des Soureaux also offered the opportunity to take a stand against the Franco regime, which was collapsing at the time the periodical was published. A reflection on identity is thus at the heart of the project, evoked by the two words which make up the name of the publication. While neon, also in Catalan, can be universally understood and evokes the artificial and aggressive brightness of the advertising mechanism in a technological consumer society, the second word remains obscure for those who do not master the language. Soureaux means cork. That is a very symbolic material for the working classes of the island, since it is essential for fishing. The first press release, which the artists published in 1975 to announce their publication, insisted on this tension between local awareness and the need to open up to international exchanges by its title, Deep Rootedness and Cosmopolitanism. The tension between local and global issues can be found as well in the periodicals of the Argentine artist Edgardo Antonio Vigo. He does not operate in a capital or a recognized artistic center, but he claimed his position from a small town, La Plata, located some 60 kilometers from Buenos Aires. La Plata was a place where, as he wrote in one of his magazines, nothing happens. The artist describes himself on another occasion as a self-marginalized outsider, as much by the geographical position he held as by the mediums and art practices in which he was involved. The title of these two most famous magazines attests to this assumed singular geographical anchor, while highlighting the way he positioned himself in relation to the rest of the world. The first, Diagonal Zero, published from 1962 to 1969, refers to the construction of La Plata. Despite its grid plan, it has a particularity of being cut by numerous diagonals, which create an incessant effect of disorientation. Vigo invented the zero diagonal, assuming an in-between position both inside and outside this grid. The title of the second periodical, Hexagono 71, which appeared from 1971 to 1976, is also a reference to the artist's daily life. The logo associated with it schematically reproduces the characteristic plan of the office where the artist, Vigo, worked as an employee of the public court of La Plata. By adding the comment uno más que USA, one more than USA, Vigo positioned himself in relation to the United States, whose colonialist posture was constantly questioned in the page of this magazine, and established an ironic competitive relationship between the two administrations. While Diagonal Zero aimed to present the local and national art scene, as the issue progressed, we can notice a growing openness to the international scene. This went together with an increased attention to visual poetry, artistic position, and a more marked intellectual commitment. The periodical became a platform for meetings, a place of marginal exchanges where local concerns were placed on the same level as participation in an international network. Hexagono 71 followed a rather opposite movement. When Vigo launched the periodical in 1971, he had already succeeded in building up an important international network thanks to his experience as a publisher and his active participation in the mail art network, then flourishing. The first issue of Hexagono 71 included contributions from Argentinian and other Latin American artists, but also, in equal proportions, contributions from European and North American artists. Regardless of the country of origin, the project worked to challenge artistic conventions. But as the political situation deteriorated in many Latin American countries, including Argentina, the periodical seemed to give up its international dimension to refocus the practices of local artists and their struggles. However, the international network remained essential. It was no longer used to feed the publication. It made it possible, thanks to the reputation acquired by the artist and his periodical, to maintain the circulation of the practices of artists who felt more and more isolated and to ensure them a visibility, whereas censorship was generalized. Schmuck magazine, another one, was published between 1972 and 1976 in England, a country with a very different political situation. Also launched from a remote farmhouse in Devon, the periodical also had international ambitions. Its editor, the British David Mayer and the Mexican Felipe Ehrenberg, had voluntarily placed themselves on the sidelines of London art scene in order to attempt, through the house publishing called Beau Geste Press, a new communitarian and artistic experience, far from the economic pressure of the art market and its logic of selection. With the exception of the first issue, each issue was dedicated to a country. A guest artist from the country in question was in charge of gathering the contributions, drawing on his own network. This concept allowed the artists who initiated the project from their remote operating base to give visibility to artist practices that were often not visible on the art scene. This periodical also enabled artists living in countries under authoritarian regimes and confronted with intense censorship to show their work. The fourth of the series, coordinated by Milan Nizak in Czechoslovakia in 1974, narrowly escaped censorship. The circumstances of production, explained in the editorial, were the occasion for the artists of the purely based Devon community, as they like to call themselves, to remind the readers that in their opinion, only a policy of decentralization is able to fight against the control of thought. The editorial is a plea for self-publishing, a call for community functioning, for sharing skills and sharing networks. They made sure to apply this policy to themselves. Quote, "This is as it should be because Bourges Press is a concept, a conviction. We never quite envision ourselves growing into art-mart fat cats. To have continued our development could easily have forced us, simply because of our size, into an exclusivist position, which is the same as being little big dictatures, much like any prestige art publisher. Circumstances led some to physically leave the community in 1974, but this would not prevent the publication of the next 4 issues. Artist periodicals demonstrated in the 60s and 70s their ability to overcome the divide between center and periphery. This is still true for many today. Whether the initial distancing from what would be a central position is chosen or suffered, they found with their periodical solution to overcome barriers, to displace centers, even to the point of questioning the very concept. The principle of decentralization and shared responsibility used in Schmuck found an ever more radical application in another project. It was from Bilād, a medium-sized coastal town in Poland, that Paweł Petasz launched Common Press, an experimental periodical that involved hundreds of artists from dozens of countries. If Devon was still a kind of pole for Schmuck, where contribution passed through to be organized, reproduced, and assembled before being redistributed, the concept that defined Common Press renders any position of center and periphery deeply irrelevant. The principle was that a different artist was responsible for the conception of each issue. Common Press is a conception of the periodical edit by common effort. Possible realization of this conception would overcome such difficulties as print and distribution expense, nothing to say about the danger of commercialization. As stated in the first call for participation distributed at the end of 1977, and then reproduced in each issue of Common Press, contributing to an issue is a commitment to take charge of a future issue. Each of the participants will be obliged to at least once collect materials to edit and print as well as to distribute the edition among the other artists taking part in his edition at one's own charge. By December 1977, when the first issue was published, the International Mail Art Network had already established itself as a self-sustaining community, quite capable of shouldering the responsibility required in maintaining a publication schedule. Indeed, more than 60 issues were published between 1977 and 1990. Each editor could choose a theme, format, and means of reproduction of his issue. Most of the time, the photocopy machine. But we can see there that depending the means the editor had, the format and the way of printing was different. Petasz edited the first issue in an A5 format with no particular theme, but the subtitle announced it as the Arrière-garde edition. 17 contributors took part in the project. In other words, 17 potential future editors. Future issue would even have more contributors. Issue 23, for example, includes the work of over 250 artists. The only constraint for each editor was that he or she had to contact Petasz. This rule was not intended to control the development of the project, but only to serve as a means to assign issues and to avoid overlapping. There were nevertheless several issues with the same numbers that appeared, while others attributed never came. In 1982, the only thread that still linked the periodical to its original port was broken. Petasz stopped the coordination of Common Press because the imposition of martial law in Poland led to censorship of the mail by the military. Pétage handed over its coordination to the Canadian artist Gerald X. Jupiter Larsen, who occupied this position for an undetermined number of years. Undertaking the edition of a periodical as a place of artistic practices, and for that creating or participating in a network, has been the occasion for the artist to wave a moving web, where what one witnesses a permanent displacement of the notion of center of periphery until making them inoperative. The artists who engage in this practice have indeed applied themselves to defend and experiment with other principles which join the mimetic territory of the Genial Republic, territoire mimétique de la République géniale, an independent territory with variable geometry that Robert Filliou placed above the floor, following a subjective cartography. The periodical proved to be the ideal place to rethink the relationships of domination and therefore the legitimacy of everyone, wherever they are, to take part in the art scene and the eternal network, another concept developed by Robert Filliou. Thank you for your attention.